Hey guys, welcome to the next installment in the Beginner's Photographer's Guide. This is a series where I put out a bunch of free videos on the internet sharing my insights and knowledge over 4 years of photography with the information format I wish I received when I first started getting into photography. Now in today's video, I'll be talking about exposure, the first pillar of what actually makes a good photo. If you haven't watched the video of the 4 basic pillars of what make a good photo, I'll put the link for it in the description below. First watch that before you come to this one. Exposure is actually the amount of light that enters into the camera. Now, this is controlled through the exposure triangle, which is comprised of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These are all 3 different technical elements of the camera that have their own way of controlling exposure, dictating whether it's underexposed, overexposed, or perfectly exposed. Now later in this video, I will be discussing my format in approaching the exposure triangle, making a perfectly balanced photo. Now let's talk about the first component of the exposure triangle, that's the aperture. The aperture is the opening of the lens of the camera. Think of the aperture as the pupil in your eye. When you enter in a dark room, your pupils actually dilate to allow more light in. Now, once you're done being in the darkness and you head out to touch some grass, the pupils actually constrict, making the opening in your eye smaller. The same logic can be applied for aperture. Now, the measurement of how big the hole is the f-stop. Now, with f-stop, the smaller the number, the bigger the hole. So this means f1.2 is bigger than f5.6. So if you're in a darker room, you want to be using f1.2, and if you're in a brighter room, you want to be in f5.6. Now, aperture also controls a different and creative element, which is your depth of field. Depth of field refers to how much amount of area that is actually in focus. So if you use a lower number, say for f1.2, you will have what we call a shallow depth of field. This means that you have like a small area of the photo actually in focus. So you see in portraits that's the dreamy background. That's what lower aperture numbers give you. Using higher aperture numbers means the background will be in focus. So this is perfect for landscape shots or group photos. Next up in the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is actually how long the sensor is exposed to the light. You could kind of think of it like as an eye. The more you blink, the less light is actually going to enter, so you'll be stuck in darkness. But the more you leave your eyes open for, you allow for the light to enter. This same logic applies for shutter speed. If that was a bad analogy, feel free to comment down below and I'll clear up any misunderstandings that you have. Shutter speed is measured over 1 over something of a second. So a faster shutter speed would be 1 over 1000 of a second compared to a slower shutter speed, which is 1 over 50th of a second. Another aspect shutter speed can control is actually the blur of an object moving. So if we have a fast moving object and you want to capture it in a still, you want to have a faster shutter speed to be able to capture. Say for car that's moving or motorsports, you want to be using higher shutter speeds of 1/1000, 1/2000. But if you want to allow for a blurry effect to happen, you want to be using a slower shutter speed, so 1 over 50th, 1 over 25. That's when you see those roller shots that you see on Instagram for car photography. That's how they get the blur. Now, a general rule with shutter speed, if you want your subject to be frozen in frame, you want to be shooting at double the focal length you're shooting at. So say you zoom on the lens is saying you're shooting at 50 millimeters, you want to be shooting at 1/100 of a shutter speed. This negates any micro jitters that you have when you're holding the camera but also pressing the button. This ensures your photo is actually sharp and is not blurry, because last time I checked, you cannot unblur a photo. Now let's talk about the final bit of the exposure triangle, ISO. ISO refers to the sensitivity of the sensor itself within the camera. Think of this as fake light. The higher the number in this case, the more fake light you're injecting. However, what comes with this fake light is what we call noise and grain. So imagine putting rice grain on top of the photo frame. This actually does not look appealing at all and actually takes away the details and sharpness from the photo. Now, there is no harm in actually having a higher ISO number, provided you've got your aperture and shutter speed set correctly. Because in post-production, you can actually denoise the photos to gain some detail back and negating any noise and grain you've put in the photo. Now that we've covered the exposure triangle, we've actually kind of touched on the basics of the shooting in manual mode. But I'll talk about how I approach a scene. So first I think to myself, do I want my subject frozen or do I want it blurry? Then I'll set my shutter speed accordingly. So if it's a fast moving object and I want it to be set still, I'll have a faster shutter speed. If I want my fast object to be blurred, I'll have a lower shutter speed. Next, I'll ask myself this: am I shooting one object or am I shooting multiple objects? So if I'm shooting a model, for instance, I want to have my f-stop number to be 1.2 or 1.8, the lower numbers. But if I'm shooting a landscape or a group photo, I want to be higher at f8. Now after setting these 2 settings up, I'll set the ISO accordingly to make sure the image is properly exposed. Because you can always denoise the photo after, but you cannot actually refocus the image after you take the shot. Congratulations, you've learned the first pillar of what actually makes a good photo, the exposure triangle. This actually sets up the premise of shooting manual mode on your camera. However, I don't suggest going there yet. What you first should do is start with automatic mode. Just build up the creative eye and the consistency of taking photos. Next, you can experiment with the different priority modes. So there's aperture and shutter priority. The manual of the camera as well as online videos will show you how to get to these modes on your specific camera. However, if you still can't find any, you can ask me and I'll be more than happy to help in the comment section. Now, these priority modes actually allow you to control the certain modes that they're in. So aperture priority will allow you to adjust only aperture and it'll control everything else for you. Same with shutter priority. You can adjust the shutter speed and it will adjust everything else for you. This will actually help you understand what I mean by the different elements having each creative element controlling other than exposure. Then once you've built up the confidence in actually understanding these two priority modes, you can go into manual mode and actually use all the three elements using my process that I use when I take a photo manually. So yeah guys, if you enjoyed this video, follow me on Instagram, and if you enjoy tutorials like these, feel free to subscribe for more.